Everyone should have got a gong up there, you know. They really should have. There were so many acts of bravery there.
So we gave them grenades and we gave them instructions. When the enemy comes, you must throw the first grenade at the enemy and kill yourselves with a second grenade.
Oh, I think killing men at close range was the most horrifying thing, to see their eyes just about turn up.
"1942 was a big year for Australia. It was the end of our innocence. The year Australia grew up. When war broke out in 1939, Australia had rallied to support Britain in the mother country's European conflict, just as we'd done in the First World War 2 decades earlier.
Fellow Australians, it is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her, and that as a result, Australia is also at war.
To most Australians, it must have seemed a familiar story. Aussies doing their duty, serving in a war at Britain's behest on the other side of the world. But Japan's unprovoked attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii in the early hours of December the 7th, 1941, changed all that. In a massive coordinated onslaught, Japan launched its conquest of Asia and the Pacific, and Australia was clearly in its path. For the first time in our brief history, another nation was trying to steal our country from us. It came as a big shock.
The big shock also was that we were unprepared and the public knew it. There were at least two reasons why we were not ready. Firstly, we had sent divisions to the Middle East to fight the Germans there. And secondly, we were relying on what was known as the Singapore strategy, under which Britain would send their fleet to be based at Singapore and to defend Australia. With what forces we did have available, we sent an AIF battalion to Rabaul, and a specially volunteered militia battalion went to Port Moresby. But even so, New Guinea was not defended properly. We had not enough planes, not enough ships, and really people thought that the Japanese would not be moving inland in New Guinea.
By the second half of 1941, the Australian Imperial Forces, known as the Second AIF, the first having served in the First World War, were acquitting themselves with distinction in the Middle East. Belatedly realizing a need for more manpower, the army began raising militia battalions.
Our Sovereign Lord the King.
Our Sovereign Lord the King.
In the military forces.
In the military forces.
Of the Commonwealth of Australia.
Of the Commonwealth of Australia.
Volunteers for these battalions joined up to defend the Australian homeland, as distinct from those who joined the AIF and volunteered to fight overseas. It was a distinction which was soon to disappear. One such militia battalion was the 39th. Raised in Victoria in October 1941, the 39th was on board the steamship Aquitania bound for Port Moresby before Christmas that year. The average age of the 39th soldiers was 18 and a half.
I imagine something like Hawaii or Honolulu or something to this effect. Sure, the palm trees were there, so were the mosquitoes and every other disease you could find. Some chaps had tennis rackets and golf clubs, cricket bats. And one chap I can remember, a little old fella, he should never have been there, never had a tooth in his head. He had a kerosene tin with a broom handle through it and a couple of strings on it and a violin bow. And he used to play. He played all the way up in the Aquitania. He was good. That was our entertainment. Anyway, we got about 3 mile out of Moresby. Very, very hot, very dry, very dusty, very dirty. And I saw something fly up in the air and go into the scrub. I thought that looked like a cricket bat. A little while later, off goes a golf club. Another golf club, something else, a fishing rod, another golf club, and we were about 6 or 7 mile out, and all of a sudden through the air goes this violin. And it disappeared into the scrub, so we never ever saw that again.
The troops soon found, to their dismay, that preparations for their arrival were virtually non-existent.
Well, we got out to the 7 mile drome, and we never had anything. No tents, no blankets, no mosquito repellent of any sort, no medicine, and we found out that everything on the tramp steams that went up with us, everything had been loaded back to front. And all our equipment that we wanted then, food and everything, was underneath.
Around the same time, the Japanese war machine was swinging smoothly into action. The 144th Regiment, raised in the southern city of Kochi on the island of Shikoku, had mobilized and embarked on the Kame Maru, bound eventually for Papua New Guinea. The men of the 144th were seasoned combat veterans, having been blooded in Japan's conflict in Manchuria as early as 1937.
By the time we landed in Papua New Guinea, we'd already fought in China, Malaya, the Philippines, and then in Papua New Guinea. And we thought that New Guinea would be the same as all the other battlefields.
On January the 23rd, the 144th Regiment, which formed the backbone of the Nankai Shitai, Japan's South Seas Detachment, became the first enemy to capture Australian territory when it landed in Simpson Harbour, Rabaul. The invaders swiftly overcame the small Australian garrison there and set about establishing Rabaul as their operational headquarters for their Southwest Pacific conquest. The Japanese strategy was to launch a two-pronged assault on Port Moresby. One by land, over the Kokoda track, a meandering, precipitous native walking path. The other by sea. From there, the Japanese intentions on Australia were clear.
By the middle of 1942, the Australian land forces in New Guinea consisted of commando-type units fighting around WW2, 6 militia battalions at Port Moresby, and 3 more arriving at Milne Bay. The Australian commander in Port Moresby, General Morris, did not want to send his forces away from Port Moresby because, well, the terrain was rough, he had few planes or a few roads, and he just couldn't supply them. But the High Command in Australia ordered him to send forces across the Owen Stanley Mountains to secure an air base at Buna. Morris selected the 39th Battalion, and they set off on foot with native porters to walk the 200 or so kilometres to Buna. They set off 1 company at a time, 1 company of about 100 men. Unbeknown to the Australians, the Japanese South Seas Force at Rabaul had been ordered to land at Buna, establish a beachhead, and then move over the mountains to attack Port Moresby from the rear. On the morning of the 22nd of July, the Japanese advance party of about 2,000 men landed at Buna and moved rapidly inland towards Kokoda. They'd soon be confronting the lead company of the 39th Battalion, about 100 Australians against 2,000 Japanese.
Our morale was so high as we were to advance to Rabaul and attack and occupy it. The voyage was long, and some got homesick, and everybody was pretty tired. Even so, we were still high in spirit and left Rabaul for Buna at night in order to capture Moresby. At that time, it was very touching. Looking at the ocean, I was filled with emotion. We left our ship offshore Buna and moved into landing craft in the dark of night to advance. However, we didn't have much knowledge about the Buna area. After landing at Buna, we found a jungle and really had a difficult time.
Nick Dorada was in his village near Buna when the invaders arrived. He relives that moment.
Japan is booted. Edonawa, man of the Pasidatana. Our not Javigene. Not Javigido. Our Nasum Nobuda. Our Petro Nawa Giza. Our Monday Mobudo Bueno. Gosser with the Gosatera. Gun vegetor plant to the booty. Our Nango Ojisum.
After the Japanese landed at Buna, they soon overcame the small patrols from the Papuan Infantry Battalion and started advancing towards Kokoda. The leading Australian company was moving towards them, one platoon at a time. But after sharp fights, they were driven back, and by the 27th of July, they were defending Kokoda. At this time, the commander of the 39th, Colonel Owen, arrived, and he found that the defenders numbered some 80 men against the advancing 2,000. He asked General Morris in Port Moresby to send reinforcements by air. Morris had only 2 planes, but he sent the planes off. But when the pilots arrived, they could not see what was going on the ground, and they were ordered to return to base.
Sam Pike was part of the group trying to get into Kokoda by air before the Japanese gained control of the airstrip.
Yes, we flew over Kokoda. We thought we were going to get it the easy way. But the pilot flew around, and there were zeros buzzing around, and he wasn't very happy about that, so we came back again to Moresby, disembarked, and then we walked back again. Took us 20 minutes to fly over, and took us 8 days to walk back.
It has to be remembered that the 39th was a very inexperienced battalion. The soldiers were young, poorly trained, and this was their first battle, although fortunately there was a hard core of very experienced officers. There were several battles for Kokoda, but this was not like Vietnam, where soldiers arrived by helicopter. The soldiers had to walk all the way across the Kokoda track from Port Moresby, and if they were wounded, they had to walk back again, or somebody else had to carry them.
We set up the ambush on the straight stretch of track, waiting to see expected to see, these small 5 for 2, 5 for 3 men come around the corner. To our amazement, when they did come round the corner, they were 6 foot or more, and they're wheeling push bikes. And considering what the track was like, we thought that was rather funny.
The initial surge of the Japanese saw them overrun Kokoda as the Australians fought a courageous campaign of hit-and-run skirmishes.
After capturing Kokoda Hill, we started to attack at the foot of the Mount Stanley, where we encountered very strong resistance from the Australian forces. We spent 3 or 4 days there. We understood that Australian forces withdrew, so we started to advance. Then we saw 3 Australian soldiers set machine gun in position and wait for us. The path we were advancing along was so narrow that we could only march in file. The regimental colors went first, followed by 15 color guards. And they came machine gun fire from their position. 7 or 8 people fell into the valley.
We were heavily outnumbered, and we felt that, was convinced that heavy patrolling was more use, and to keep the enemy guessing was hitting them and running and turning back and hitting them behind again and running. If we could do this, we would confuse them to the point of where they would be held up, not knowing just how many troops were against them. The point was subsequently proved on the northern coast when we captured a brigade headquarters documents indicating they thought at the time there were some 6,000 troops against them, and we wouldn't have numbered more than about 110.
When the battle died down, we came out in the open, and there on the ground was a Japanese soldier. He'd taken a burst of machine gun fire. He was almost cut in half. He was in a hell of a mess. The officer said, "Smokey, finish him off." With that, I looked down, and he looked back at me. And I've been looking at those eyes ever since.
Unlike the Gulf War, which was a bit like a computer war, this was an intensely personal war as the soldiers fought man to man as they withdrew up the mountains towards Ishirava, where the battalion would hold out, waiting for the reinforcements to arrive. During the fighting for Kokoda, the commander of the 39th had been killed, and he was succeeded here by Colonel Ralph Honour, who was back from the Middle East where he had a really splendid record. Honour rallied the battalion, waiting for the reinforcements. Firstly, the 53rd Militia Battalion, and then a bit later, the 2nd 14th AIF Battalion back from the Middle East.
Yes, they were in pretty bad shape because they'd been in action for, some of them, for about 3 weeks, and all of them, to some extent, under fire at Kokoda and Deneki before falling back on Ishurava. They were worn out not only because of the fighting, but because of inadequate food and complete lack of shelter. It rained every day and all night, and so their only chance of sleep was during the daytime when it wasn't raining, and they were not likely to be jumped by an enterprising enemy.
The 2nd 14th Battalion, an AIF unit rushed back from the Middle East, was standing by to relieve the 39th back down the track at Afogi, awaiting supplies.
We're looking forward to meeting the Japanese over the mountains just ahead of us. And we had little campfires and we had sing-alongs. My brother, who was a platoon commander of 10 Platoon, he invited me up from, because I was an intelligence officer of battalion at that stage, from battalion headquarters. He said, come up. And I sang a few songs of his favourites and what his platoon liked. And I can well remember that in those moments while I was singing, I just had that feeling, premonition that dear old Butch, my brother, whom I loved so much, that he was going to be killed. And it was a strange feeling, but it was something that lived in my memory. And I never dreamt that a couple of weeks later that I'd hold him in my arms at Ishurava for about 4 hours while he died, his hand in mine, and we talked about some of our good days and our bad days.
The Battle of Ishurava, one of the most ferocious and crucial in the Southwest Pacific Theatre, began on August the 26th, when the battered remnants of the 39th Battalion were set upon by an enemy overwhelmingly superior in numbers and firepower.
While the Australians were desperately trying to reinforce the 39th Battalion up there at Ishurava, the Japanese had sent the remainder of their force to Papua. And General Horry, commanding the South Seas Force, for the coming battle would have 13,500 Japanese, and 10,000 of these would be combat troops against perhaps 500 Australians.
During the battle, we had advanced about 200 meters. And I remember that an Australian soldier, wearing just a pair of shorts and stripped to the waist, came running towards us, throwing hand grenades at us. And I remember thinking at the time that this was something that would be very hard for a Japanese soldier to do. Even now, when I think about it, I'm affected by the memory of this warrior. I suppose the Australians had a different motivation for fighting, but this soldier, this warrior, was far braver than any in Japan, I think. And when I think about it, now it still affects me.
They should have bypassed us by going along through Naro and along the Naro Ridge to Alola, cut us off from our supplies, our water, and we'd have been finished as a fighting force. They didn't do that, and I think it was a grave lapse on the Japanese commander's part that he did not do that instead of throwing his troops at us where we were dug in and where we could kill them in a ratio of possibly 10 to 1. There is a big advantage for a defence which is built in, sitting in weapon pits, firing at people, coming at them and not knowing exactly where they are. I think the Japs lost out tactically on not wiping the 39th out at Ishiarava. But as for their actual fighting capacity, they were good troops, they were good trained troops, and they were seemingly fearless. Almost fanatical in their fearlessness.
We got a message from Port Moresby that the 2nd 14th were on the way, and they had to fight to the finish. There was no give-in at all. We had to stay there, fight till death. And that was a bit horrifying. I thought, well, I won't see my family again, I won't see Australia again. But I was prepared, like the rest of us, to stay there and fight to the finish.
You need a special kind of courage. When you draw your sword and point it forward like that, this is a display of your own courage as well as a signal to the men. It doesn't just mean, right, we are going to attack now. In that sense, it is a signal, but also as a deeply linked to your personality and courage. It's like in music when the conductor raises the button to the orchestra. It's the same as music. However, instead of raising the button, you draw your sword and say, charge. You give the order. Obviously, you are not trying to cut the opponent. It's in order to get everybody up and into the attack.
The first reinforcements of the 2nd 14th arrived at Ishiarava on the afternoon of the 26th of August in the nick of time.
We would have been wiped out that evening or the next morning if we had stayed there. And I was going to stay there because the reinforcement was promised. And I was just hoping like hell it was coming, because if it hadn't come, we'd have been done. I couldn't implement a plan of withdrawal in the face of an incoming reinforcement. We had to stay, they had to get to us. The rest of the 2nd 14th arrived on the 27th and 28th of August, but by that time there were 4 battalions of Japanese attacking us, and I advised Brigadier Potts, who had taken command of Maroubra Force, that I couldn't leave the 2nd 14th alone to face them because it was more than enough for 1 battalion. So our fellows had been promised relief for the past week and were ordered out, were then ordered to stay on.
When I arrived, we saw what was left of the 39th. We'd heard what they'd been through, and I was personally surprised to see that men who looked so down and out could come back for more. They were volunteering to stop with us, and we were gratified because we needed every person. Anyone that could hold a rifle or a gun was needed. And it was amazing the way the 2 sides of the Australian Army came together without let or hindrance. It was encouraging. It was a morale booster.
The 39th, seeing the arrival of the 2nd 14th Battalion originally, blokes nearly twice as big as themselves, and well armed, well equipped and ready for a fight. They thought they were, one bloke said, I thought they were gods.
The selfless devotion of the 39th set the tone for a monumental struggle in which both sides fought themselves to a standstill.
The platoon consists of a lieutenant, a sergeant, a runner, and 3 corporals and 27 other ranks, which is a total of 33 people. We were on a ridge forward of the rest of the company, and the Japs were hammering us with machine guns and lopping all the undergrowth away, which was our cover, until such time as we were completely denuded and there we were exposed to them entirely. We had more or less just taken over from some boys from the 39th Battalion, and the Japs started coming up the hill towards us, and I can remember we threw, I would say, about 100 grenades into them, and they eventually overran us, and it was at this stage that we were completely more or less decimated. There were The final result was there were 14 killed and 18 wounded in our platoon. I can't remember who the bloke was that wasn't touched, but, you know, they completely wiped our platoon out.
I remember that all my junior officers, my NCOs, and most of my men lost their lives. Accordingly, all we could think of doing was leaving the place we were in and attacking up the hill, and we were being told by the officers from behind, attack, attack. So there was no courage. Just without thinking, we attacked and attacked.
Everyone should have got a gong up there, you know. They really should have. There were so many acts of bravery there. Now, fella, there's a Jappy jumped into a foxhole there once and he bit a bloke's big lump out of his jaw. The combat was that close, you see.
It was in this cauldron, just when the Japanese appeared set to overrun his platoon, that Private Bruce Kingsbury joined the Immortals.
We were in danger of being overrun for a long time, you see. When I say a long time, a half an hour of that action is a long time, you see. It wasn't a day and a half or a day or anything like it, but half a day. It's a wonder anybody survived, you know, because of the gunfire, because there was so much of it from both sides. The place was absolutely just flattened. But Bruce did come out and take over and sort of just cleared the way. There were clumps of Japs here and there, and he just mowed them down.
We'd lost our platoon sergeant and the platoon commander, and personally I'd been hit in the nose with a piece of shrapnel. It hit my tooth here and flew up into my nose, and I had blood everywhere, all over my shirt, and as I looked at myself I thought I was going to die, but then I realised I wasn't. And so I was able to continue on. And then during the fight that I've just described, I was hit twice in this leg down below, and that almost incapacitated me. I was having trouble walking then. I still had this Bren gun, and the handle of the Bren gun was so hot I couldn't handle it, so I had to grab the tripod underneath. And then I reached the stage where I just couldn't go any further. I was physically exhausted, I couldn't walk, I couldn't do anything, so I had to go back. And I handed the gun over to a man by the name of Bruce Kingsbury.
I reckon he almost gave his life away because you're so... there's nothing scared about it. He just went straight into him as if bullets didn't mean anything, you know. And we all got a bit of the action, you see, when we saw him. Well, and when you see a thing like that, you sort of follow the leader, don't you? And that's what we did, but he did a marvellous job.
Bruce Kingsbury was killed by a sniper at the moment of his glory. He was to become the first to win a Victoria Cross on Australian territory. But despite the diggers' resolute resistance, the Japanese pressed on relentlessly, suffering fearful losses.
Just in front of one of the key positions in the higher ground, where my brother, Butch, had his platoon, 10 platoon, and Mocker Tracy, who was subsequently awarded the MC, he had 11 platoon. They in turns occupied this position, and they withstood something like 30 or 40 separate attacks by the Japanese, company and 2 company attacks. And when our chaff force came through some weeks later, when the Japanese were forced to withdraw, they counted 350 graves in front of this position. So for 350 killed, there'd be at least 1,000 that would have been wounded. So these are casualties that just 2 platoons of our battalion inflicted.
Although the Australian defenders took a massive toll of the Japanese, the besiegers' superiority in numbers meant the result of the contest was inevitable, and the Australians were forced to make a fighting withdrawal to avoid being overrun and annihilated.